Here's the funny thing about the 3 Atlas missions. On the day of the flyby, everyone thought the story ended exactly where the news footage ended. The dot in the sky had disappeared, the schedule had safely closed, and everyone went home satisfied. But we didn't drift apart, because the real story began not at the moment of closest convergence, but the next day, when the data suddenly became too orderly. Not beautiful, not noisy. The exact order that appears where someone draws a ruler. You know that nasty effect. When a million random events suddenly form a single line, and the brain's first instinct is to try to calm itself down. Coincidence. Statistics. We're just looking too closely. Nice words. Convenient. We spent the first 24 hours after the flyby tidying up loose ends. We checked ephemerides, closed discrepancies, and signed reports that were supposed to be boring. And then, in one of those boring packets, I saw something I couldn't unsee. There was a residue. A slight difference between what we expected and what actually happened. Nothing dramatic at first glance. Tiny deviations which are always there. But the form of these deviations was wrong. Too smooth. I asked for an archive download for all channels where Atlas had any kind of presence. Optical data, radio frequency range, spectra, timing, everything. And I specifically asked Bobines Isiritius for the most thankless request. A background search run, a search of the emptiness near the root. When you search for interstellar objects, you always hit a wall. They're invisible until they become a sensation. Until then, they're lost in the data like a grain of sand on a beach. And it's all about the filter. We've already honed the filter for Atlas to the point of pain. We've learned to capture its rhythm, its traces in navigation errors, its strange coincidences with resonance nodes. We didn't call it a pattern out loud, but that's what we thought. And so we turned on the same filter to the area of the sky where Atlas was already fading, just to make sure the nail in the spectrum was disappearing, just as any normal tail effect should. And then the first cold weather arrived. A dot appeared in the logs. Weak, dirty, almost uncertain. It could have been thrown out as trash, if not for one characteristic. The geometry of movement. Too hyperbolic, too out of place to be ordinary junk. At first, we decided it was a binding error. Then that it was an old satellite. Then that it was a calibration artifact. We went through the whole list, because that's how normal science works. First kill the miracle, then talk about the miracle. But the dot persisted. It appeared in different instruments on different nights. It was too faint to be noticed in the news, and persistent enough that it couldn't honestly be called a glitch in a single telescope. I called Tom, the same one who was the first to say at the monitor that Atlas was maneuvering. He looked at the tracks, paused, and said something that made me feel even worse than the fact that I'd seen the dot. She lies down on our corridor. That is, it's not just flying somewhere nearby. It's falling into the same pattern where Atlas showed its strangest coincidences. The same nodes, the same areas of increased sensitivity in the Sun-Earth-Moon system. We opened the resonant surface model we'd built for Atlas and overlaid the new candidate. It looked as if someone had taken a transparent sheet of paper with the root and carefully placed it on top of the old one. There was a difference, of course, but the type of coincidence was the same. It was as if the object wasn't flying as it happened, but rather someone was choosing trajectories that maximized visibility while minimizing the risk of panic. And here comes a question that's more frightening than any talk of aliens. If this is true, if it's not noise, then why do it this way? Not to hit, not to scare, not to leave a mark on the sky, but to walk down a corridor that forces us to watch. We gave the new object a temporary name, Guess 2. No pretentiousness, no fancy name. It's easier to keep our brains in working order. Names take on a life of their own, and we needed something realistic. From that moment on, everything in the lab became two-layered. The top layer was ordinary work, reports, formulations, calm interviews for popular science. The bottom layer was closed chats, short calls, and one thought no one wanted to utter. If a second candidate emerged after Atlas, then Atlas wasn't an event. It was a stage, a calibration, a rehearsal for how we respond to strangeness that doesn't kill us, but forces us to restructure our observational systems. And then another unpleasant question pops into my head. How many of these guests have passed before we simply couldn't see? And how many will pass now that we've learned? Because learned is also a signal. We didn't sleep well for the next 2 days. Not because it was scary in the movie sense, but because we had data that required either an explanation or an honest admission that there was no explanation. The first thing we did was check the direction. Where exactly Guess 2 was relative to the Atlas route? It turned out it wasn't behind in the conventional sense. It was traveling at a different angle, but it was entering a similar junction geometry. This is an important distinction. If he had been flying directly on the trail, we could have blamed it on debris, on candidates clumped together, on an error separating objects in the data. But he didn't copy, he rhymed. We dug through the spectral archives, especially those strange narrow peaks that we started calling the nail in our conversations. We didn't write that down in the reports. The report said a narrow, stable line of unknown origin. And here's oddity number 1. The line also appeared on GOST2. Not always, not on all instruments. But when the object passed through the same sensitive areas, the line would flash in short pulses. Do you understand what this means? If it's a molecule, it shouldn't wink according to the resonance schedule. If it's noise, it shouldn't coincide with the nodes of phase space. If it's a coincidence, it's too industrious. Then we did what people do when they're afraid of their own interpretations. We handed the data over to another group for blind review, without context, without the words Atlas. Simply, check the match statistics. The reply came a day later. Dry, merciless. The probability of a random coincidence in the given form is below the threshold we usually consider significant. A physical cause or systematic error is required. And here comes the most unpleasant part. Because systematic error is a convenient enemy. You can catch it, fix it, close it. But a physical cause in this form is a door into darkness. Tom proposed a simple test. If Guess 2 really did fit into our scheme, then its trajectory should correlate with the same micro-glitch effects that we saw on the Atlas approach. We reviewed the navigation logs, GPS anomalies, accuracy dips, jittery switching to backup time sources. At the time, we chalked it up to the ionosphere in normal space weather. Now we see things differently. And yes, in the windows where Guess 2 crossed nodes, micro-tremors appeared again in the global data. Weaker, shorter, more diffuse, but the shape was familiar, as if someone were repeating an exercise, but with a smaller amplitude. It was like testing an instrument, first loudly, then quietly, to make sure you can still hear. Because if you can hear quietly, it means you've become more sensitive. It means you're ready for the next step. I caught myself thinking a nasty thought. We are being trained to see, and they are doing it through our own systems, through our own infrastructure, through the satellite network, through telescope schedules, through how we react to rare events. In normal astronomy, an object is just an object. You look at it, measure it, build a model. Here, the model seemed to be looking back, not with its eyes, not with the mind from the movies, but with a structure of interactions. We decided to check one more thing. Guess 2 should have appeared in the archives retroactively. If it's an interstellar object, it doesn't just suddenly appear out of nowhere. It was already in the data, just too faint. And we found it. 2 dots in old frames. Insignificant. It's almost embarrassing to call them detections, but they fit the trajectory during reverse propagation, given the same corridor geometry. It was no longer possible to calmly call it coincidence, because the coincidence had begun to recede into time. It was as if Guess 2 had been flying for a long time, and only now had we learned to look where it should be. Now add to this one fact that would normally seem like a decoration, but in reality, it felt like a knife. The timing of Guess 2's appearance in our data coincided with the moment we intensified monitoring after Atlas. That is, as soon as we raised the network's sensitivity, as soon as we increased the frequency of observations, as soon as we became louder with our technological activity, a second candidate appeared. We called the people at DSN again. We asked about echo packets, weak reflections, and strange telemetry duplicates. Their response was cautious. We see occasional reverberations. We usually attribute them to multipath, but now these reverberations also fall within the node's time windows. Not ideal, but enough to make something click unpleasantly inside, because multipath doesn't read our ephemerides. That evening, Lynn brought back a printout. It contained 2 curves. The first was the intensity of the nail, according to Atlas. The second was the pulses according to Guess 2, and her signature, short and angry. It's not a single object, it's a method. And then, for the first time, I was truly overcome not by fear, but by a sense of scale. Because method is no longer a random act of celestial mechanics. It's repeatability. And repeatability is intention, even if it's physical. There comes a point when you realize you can't stay within the familiar "we're observing" framework any longer. because the framework starts to break down over small details, over how mistakes are distributed, over how timings match up. We did something that people don't like to do publicly. We compiled a map of our observing habits. Which telescopes look where and when? What frequencies we use for calibration? Where are our blind spots? And when are we the noisiest? If you want to understand why an object is behaving strangely, sometimes you have to admit that the strangeness might be in the way you're looking at it. We've compiled a global view of Earth profile, a timeline of our technosphere, and then they superimposed the trajectory of Guess 2 on it. The picture turned out to be shockingly accurate. At the moments when our network was most synchronized, when major observatories were calibrating against quasars, when the DSN switched to distant satellites, Guess 2 would flash. It's as if someone was choosing the moments when we have the most precise rulers turned on. Not when we watch a lot, but when we watch precisely. And this is crucial, because precision is the level of civilization in numbers. Tom said, "If I wanted to evaluate someone else's surveillance system, this is exactly how I'd do it." He wasn't talking about aliens. He was talking like an engineer. Send a test signal through the maximum sensitivity window. Get a response. Then we took the next step. We tried to cheat. We shifted the calibration schedule. We asked a couple of observatories to conduct observations during unusual windows, purely as an experiment. And then something happened that I don't like to talk about even now, because it sounds too beautiful, too plotty. But it happened. The flashes on Guess 2 moved along with the windows. Not perfect, not on command, but noticeable, as if the object isn't simply intersecting geometry, but reacting to when we're paying maximum attention. And if we shift our attention, the signal adjusts. I understand how dangerous this is as an interpretation. We could have created the illusion ourselves because we were looking for a coincidence, but there was something in the numbers that can't be explained by psychology, a delay in reaction. The signal didn't appear instantly. It picked up after a fixed amount of time had passed since the window had changed. It was as if the system needed to notice our new rhythm, evaluate it, and only then activate. This isn't proof of intelligence. It's not even proof of control, but it is proof that our model is missing an element that connects the object and our observation network through something other than light. Lin proposed a model that sounds technical and therefore more frightening than science fiction. It's not about a signal, it's about a channel. We don't see a message. We see that the channel is open and its parameters are changing. If this is true, then the golden color of Atlas, the nail in the spectrum, the DSN echo packets, and the GPS jitter are all different manifestations of the same thing. Not different miracles, but a single mechanism interacting with the environment. And then the second guest is not a continuation of the fairy tale, but a repetition of the experiment. We began digging deeper into the dynamics. Guess 2, according to preliminary estimates, had weaker activity but a cleaner geometry. It moved in a way that minimized the influence of normal disturbances. That is, it was less visible through optics, but more heard through our strange channels. And this again smacked of intent. First, you present yourself to people as a beautiful comet, so they'll turn on their cameras. Then you come back with a weak signal to check that the cameras haven't turned off and that the network has become more sensitive. It's like training. First a big hint, then a small test. I kept coming back to one moment in the Atlas story, Mars. That microturn that created the effect of a too precise approach. We debated back then whether it could be a gas outburst. Things got even more unpleasant with Guess 2. It showed no signs of a strong ejection at all, but its trajectory still passed through the same pedals of celestial mechanics that enhance the impact without much risk. You know what's the worst thing about these trajectories? They look natural. No sudden maneuvers. No fantastic acceleration. Just choosing a corridor in a vast space of possible paths. And this choice can be made in advance. Years. Decades. It's not a steering wheel at a turn. It's a route plan. And if the plan is repeated at different sites, then the question is no longer who's steering, but who's planning. At the end of the third day, we had an internal table. On the left are Atlas events. On the right are Guess 2 events. Between them is the time and node coincidence coefficient. When Tom finished his calculations, he didn't smile. He simply said, "If these are statistics, then they are statistics that replicate the structure of our technosphere. And the structure of the technosphere is not random." I went outside, to an ordinary city. Cars, lights, people. The sky was black as always, and I caught myself thinking that the scariest things in space aren't the size or the speed. The scariest thing is when something in space starts taking us into account. Not as a romantic idea, but as a parameter in an equation. Because equations don't argue, they just work. The problem with the second guess is that it's too convenient for any bad hypothesis. Want to believe in rare noise? Go ahead. Want to believe in secret technologies? Go ahead. Want to believe in someone else's experiment? Go ahead. And that's dangerous, because the brain loves history and science loves boredom. We tried to hold on to boredom. We did tests that are of no interest to anyone, but kill the romance. First, we excluded all known object catalogs. Satellites, stages, debris, asteroids, everything. Guess 2 didn't match. Second, we checked the instrument classification. We compared different arrays. The signal was located in different systems. Third, we checked to see if we'd painted it in ourselves with the filter. This is a classic mistake. When a filter is focused on one object, it starts seeing similar ones where there aren't any. We overtrained the filter, made it dumber, then smarter. Then we removed the key atlas features. Guess 2 didn't disappear. It weakened, but it didn't die. That was worse than if it had disappeared, because disappearance would provide relief, and persistence would provide commitment. If an object can withstand the filter's degradation, then there's real structure in the data, which the filter merely extracts. And then we took a step that's usually avoided. We looked at the entire stream of interstellar candidates from recent years and asked a very simple question. Which of them rhyme with our node diagram? The answer was small, but it existed. There were several candidates who had previously been considered trash, weak, dubious, but under the new scheme, they suddenly made sense. Not as confirmation, but as a hint that Atlas wasn't the first object to pass through the corridor. It was the first to pass through the corridor in the era of the dense technosphere and intense surveillance, when coincidences became visible. This means we could have lived alongside this for decades and not known it. And it means that now that we know, we ourselves have become part of the statistics. We have become a filter that has altered the reality of observation. Lynn said very quietly, "We're no longer passive." She didn't mean we're interfering. She meant that any civilization with such a network of radiation ceases to be a silent point in space. That same day, new ionospheric data arrived. Minor changes in radio wave reflection. No drama. But the timing of the structure coincided with the flare windows of Guess 2. We could have dismissed this as atmospheric variability, but the coincidence repeated itself. And it repeated itself precisely when our own activity was directed toward the right sector of the sky. It sounds as if someone is listening to us through the atmosphere. I don't mean to sound mystical. I say this as an engineering fact. The atmosphere is part of our radio channel, and someone is influencing the channel during communication. Then came the thing I feared most, because it's no longer about interpretation, but about action. One of the large telescopes, which we'd asked to make a non-standard window, suddenly suffered a guidance system failure. Officially, it was a sensor failure. It happens. But the error log was strange. The system thought the reference star was slightly off by a fraction of an arcsecond, and that was enough to disrupt the session. If you've never worked with precision instruments, it's hard to appreciate how little it takes for things to go wrong. A milliarc second is nothing, but that nothingness kills precision. We checked our orientation using other stars. Everything was fine. We checked the mechanics. Everything was fine. We checked the software. Everything was fine. And one unpleasant hypothesis remained. In a specific window, someone had touched our orientation. It could have been the atmosphere. It could have been a local effect. But during that window, Guess 2 was giving off a flare. And here we return to the idea of a test. Because a test isn't just about showing off. A test is about testing boundaries. If an object can influence microscopic elements of our precision, it can assess how advanced we are. It can test whether we can distinguish reality from noise. Now imagine you're not human, and you don't need to speak. You need to classify, identify levels, determine what's in front of you, a planet with life, a planet with civilization, a civilization with a distant canal. Then you won't write us a letter. You'll run the object through our devices, see what we see how we react, see how quickly we strengthen the network. And if we strengthen the network after Atlas, and Guess 2 was introduced as a control test, then the next test will be more difficult. Because training a system always means increasing the level of complexity. Something had emerged within NASA that was never visible from the outside. A division had developed between two camps. One camp wanted to shut the subject down. We can't prove it, so it doesn't exist. The other camp wanted to expand monitoring, and both camps were right in their own way. Because expanding monitoring means sending out even more radiation, even more signals, even more us. And closing the topic means deliberately going blind. On the third night, we got a rough estimate. If Guest 2's trajectory is confirmed, it will pass through the inner system in a few months. Not as close as Atlas, but close enough to replicate some of the effects. So we had time, and that was the worst part. Because time is an opportunity to prepare, and preparation is also a signal. Any observer will see that we are mobilizing. I caught myself thinking that for the first time in history, we're thinking not just about what kind of object is this, but also about what does it reveal about us. And it was ceasing to be a scientific task. It was becoming a mirror. In conventional astronomy, a forecast is a calming experience. You build a model, add data, and reduce uncertainty. Here, the forecast has begun to look like a calendar of events that we ourselves provoke with our attention. We try to draw conclusions from what we've already seen. If there's a corridor, if there are nodes, then there are places where the object is most sensitive to the Earth-Moon system. And that means we can predict the windows of future outbursts. We've compiled a schedule, not public, unofficial, just for ourselves. The dates when Guest 2 will cross key resonant surfaces, and we've prepared spectral and timing monitoring in advance. It was the first time I felt like a participant in a game, not a scientist, where the rules weren't determined by humans. It was as if we were setting traps for someone who had already passed by, and testing whether they would work, and the traps worked. In the first window, the flare was weak but distinct. A narrow line in the millimeter range rose exactly within the allotted minutes. In the second window, the flare was shorter but stronger. Something happened in the third window that knocked the ground out of the water. The line didn't just flare up. It shifted in frequency by an amount that coincided with the change in the mode of our own satellite network at that orbital altitude. The alignment was too precise to be random, too technical to be chemical. It was like tuning to a grid, as if the object had an internal oscillator and our technosphere was an external reference. You might say, we're just being lazy, and I'd agree. If we didn't have one more thing, a delayed echo on the DSN, which also amplified precisely during these windows. Echo is the most sneaky thing because it always looks like an error, but it becomes scary when it starts repeating the structure of what you're transmitting. And that's exactly what we saw. Pieces of our packets were coming back. Not all of them, not in a row, but it was enough for the operator to say, it's like a channel check. He wasn't a mystic, he was a techie, and he spoke the language of his work. At this point, a suggestion came up that made many in the room shrug. Let's send a specially crafted packet, not a message, not a greeting, just a test sequence. Do you understand why this is scary? Because it's already a step away from the role of observer. And if the whole point of the corridor is to watch us, then any active test we make could become an answer in someone else's model. We debated for a long time, and in the end we chose the most cowardly and correct option. Send nothing forward, only passive observation, and at the same time, minimize network changes so as not to send unnecessary signals. But minimizing changes is impossible, because observation itself alters the behavior of the technosphere. The more telescopes you turn on, the more synchronization and radiation you create. It's a vicious circle. To understand, you need to look. To look, you need to shine. To shine, you become visible. And if someone truly calibrates, you become part of the calibration. Against this backdrop, the public world took on a life of its own. Fewer people wrote about Atlas. Other topics were trending, and this too was unpleasant. Public attention was waning, and our internal schedules were becoming increasingly unsettled, because Guest 2 was starting to gather, not in the sense of brightness, but in the sense of certainty. Its orbit was becoming more precise, and the more precise it became, the more pronounced its impact with the corridor became. Tom once said, "It's as if the object already knew we were going to measure it." I asked him not to say that out loud, not because I didn't believe it, but because such statements too easily become legend. But we didn't need a legend. We needed mathematics. And the mathematics said the following. If the correlations continue, we can expect a peak in the effects at the next node, which will occur when Guest 2 is close to Earth's orbit, not close to people, close to our infrastructure, in the zone where satellite orbits, debris fields, resonances, and where a small impulse alters long trajectories. And here again, the most unpleasant meaning of the corridor emerges. It was designed to affect not the Earth directly, but its surroundings. It affects what we've been building for decades: orbital belts, communications, navigation. You can't destroy a civilization with a single blow. You can make its environment unstable. You can make orbits worse. You can make warnings more complex. You can make debris more dangerous. You can make communications noisier. I'm not saying this is happening. I'm saying the corridor looks like it was created for such effects, should someone so desire. That's what's most frightening. Potential without demonstration. On the fifth night, we received a letter from an independent observatory. An amateur one, but a very high-quality one. They weren't aware of our internal circuitry. They simply noted something odd. The object is behaving unusually in photometry. Small dips in brightness at precisely defined moments. Not like rotation, not like gas pulsations, as if something was blocking the radiation. Too regular to be a tail. We superimposed these points on our node map. They matched. And then things got really tough. Because independent amateurs aren't NASA, JPL, or a conspiracy. They're an external reality that confirms the structure. We sat in silence. And for the first time, I thought, if all this is true, then we're now observing not an object, but a route protocol. And Atlas was page 1, and Guess 2 was page 2. And if so, then the protocol has further pages. The only question is how many, and what will be the price of each subsequent page if our technosphere is already marked as interesting enough. The most dangerous thing about this story isn't that we don't understand. We didn't understand a lot of things before. The dangerous thing is that we've started predicting the behavior of strangeness and seeing confirmation. When you can predict noise, it's no longer noise. It's structure. And structure exists in nature, but it's rarely so conveniently tied to human systems, to our calibration schedules, and to the rhythm of satellite orbits. On the day Guess 2 crossed the next node, we kept everything as quiet as possible. Minimal activations, minimal schedule changes. We wanted to see if the flare would appear without our illumination, and the flash appeared. Weaker, but it appeared, as if the object didn't need our action. It needed our presence. Our technosphere itself is a background, strong enough to work with. And then I realized that no contact is a myth. We are already in contact by existing as a civilization, with radio noise and precise rulers. Contact occurs not in words, but in dimensions. That same day, new calculations arrived from the dynamics team. They estimated how the distribution of orbital debris and sensitive bodies would change as Guess 2 passed through the corridor. The picture wasn't apocalyptic, but it was unpleasant. A few % increase in uncertainty for a number of orbits. Increased intersection probabilities in certain windows. Nothing that kills tomorrow, but everything that complicates life in the years to come. So, again, the same style of influence. Not a blow, not a catastrophe, but a gentle nudge at the environment that keeps civilization in orbit. Like a test, how dependent are you on fine-tuning? I found myself thinking it was like a resilience test. If you can gently shake a system and see how it reacts, you learn more about it than if you just looked at its lights. And then came the final detail, which made everything inside me go cold and clear. We received an archived run of data from previous years, from those same weak candidates that were garbage. The new algorithm found another trace, not as convincing as Guess 2, but with the same rhyme. And the most disturbing thing, it coincided with a period when humanity was sharply increasing radio noise. It wasn't a scientific conclusion, it was a hypothesis, but it was simple. The louder we become, the more frequent visitors appear, passing through our sensitive corridors. Not necessarily because they're flying toward us, because we become a visible object on the map. And then interstellar trajectories cease to be just trajectories. They become possible routes through nodes of interest. In a normal world, you think, space is vast, the probability is small, and that's true. But the probability changes when someone chooses. And choice isn't magic, it's simply having a goal. I'm not saying Guess 2 is intelligent in the human sense. I don't want to slap the word intelligent on him at all, because it's the laziest word in stories like this. It closes the question instead of opening it. All I'm saying is this. We have a repeatable structure in our data, and it matches the way our observations and our infrastructure are structured. And if this is a natural process, it's eerily similar to how we conduct our own tests. That evening, we gathered again in the small, windowless room where we usually discuss boring technical matters. And for the first time, the conversation was honest, without defensive language. Tom said, "We're being calibrated." Lynn said, "Or maybe we're seeing for the first time that the cosmos has been working this way for a long time, and we've just been blind to it." This is an even worse option, because there's no culprit. There's only a reality where we're not the center. I said the third thing. I said, if there's a protocol, it has criteria. And criteria are something that can be measured. If we understand what exactly is being measured, we'll understand what we need to change in ourselves to stop being a convenient target. It sounds like paranoia, but it also sounds like strategy. Because if the problem is that we're too loud and too predictable in our rhythms, then part of the defense isn't weapons but noise hygiene, less unnecessary emissions, more randomized schedules, segmentation, alternative channels, any measures that make us less convenient for testing. Not because they'll come, but because it's rational. That night, I looked at the sky again. And you know what was the strangest thing? There was nothing scary there. No lights, no tails, no signs of history, just black depths. But now I saw in this depth not emptiness, but trajectories. And I understood that a trajectory is not just a line. It is an opportunity to pass by in such a way that we can see, and in such a way that we cannot prove anything. If Atlas was an event, then guest 2 is a test to see if we've learned our lesson. And the next guest, if there is one, will test something else. Not our ability to observe, but our ability to draw conclusions. And at this point, any normal person would ask, what's next? What happens next is what always happens after calibration. The work begins. The real work, the quiet work, with bleak statistics and nasty coincidences. And if you think the scariest thing is seeing a bright object in the sky, you're wrong. The scariest thing is seeing that the object in the sky takes your civilization into account as a parameter. Because after this, you can no longer return to the old fairy tale where we simply look at space and space is silent. Space is not silent, it responds. Just not with words, but with roots. The morning after that night, we had a strange feeling, as if everything had already happened, and we were simply catching up with protocol. Not something will happen, but it's already been set in motion. And the only question now isn't whether we believe it or not, but what exactly the next inspection will look like. The first thing any system does when it realizes it's caught in an observation loop is try to break the loop. Not with force, not with volume, but with methodology. We've developed a blind window plan. The idea is simple. If flashes are tied to our habits, then we must create observation windows that are not tied to habits, resonances, or convenience. Not shift it an hour. That's too human. We created a schedule that looked alien, jagged, unpredictable, and we sent it to several teams without them even knowing why they needed it. Some were told we were testing a new calibration scheme. Others that we were looking for systematic patterns in the noise. Still others that we were testing the model's robustness in the event of gaps. It was unpleasant but necessary, because as soon as you tell people we're looking for a signal, they start looking for it with their eyes, and eyes are good at finding what they want. Tom grumbled that this wasn't right, that it was ruining the culture. I told him, culture is when everything is calm. But when you suspect the world is interacting with your network, culture is a luxury. We needed honesty, and that always looks ugly. A day later, we received the first results, and they were worse than any beautiful proof. In the blind windows, the flashes for guest 2 didn't disappear. They weakened. They became more sparse. But most importantly, they stopped latching onto nodes, as if someone had switched the mode from demonstration to search. I remember Lynn saying it quietly, almost in a whisper, even though no one in the room had slept for 3 nights. He doesn't just match, he adapts. This word is dangerous because it has an all-too-human connotation, but we used it not as a romantic notion, but as a feature of the data. Adaptation is when statistics change form in response to changing external conditions, and does so not chaotically, but in a way that preserves function. The function seemed to be one, to remain detectable just enough to keep us watching, but not so much that we could confidently say it out loud at a press conference. The nastiest thing is the level. At a low enough level, you can always call it noise. But at a high enough level, panic sets in, and then the object ceases to be a test. It becomes a threat. Guest 2 remained in the corridor of weakness. It was as if he knew how to be almost. We started arguing about what exactly it was measuring. If it adjusts to the windows, then it's not our eyes per se that matter to it, but our ability to synchronize, our time discipline, our standards. Because the whole point of civilization in space isn't rockets. It's timing. Any network that can keep time can maintain communication. Any network that can maintain communication can maintain coordination. And coordination is the level at which the world ceases to be simply biology. And that's where we made what I now consider a turning point. We looked at clocks not as tools, but as surfaces for influence. We looked at statistics on atomic time standards, on distributed servers, on those unnoticeable pillars that support everything from banking transactions to satellite guidance. And they found something small, so small that no one would have noticed it in ordinary life. In the blind graph windows, some nodes were showing micro discrepancies that would then disappear. Not a glitch, not an accident. Micro drift. If this had happened once a month, it could have been attributed to anything, but it happened precisely on the day Guest 2 announced the regime change. Lynn looked at me as if it were my fault I existed. "He touches time," she said, and at that moment the room became too quiet. Not the silence of a movie, but the silence of people who understand they can no longer hide behind convenient words. Touching time doesn't mean stopping the clock. It means changing the phase in the channel. Just a little. Just enough for the technosphere itself to begin producing additional parameters. Because when the system tries to compensate for phase drift, it gets even louder. It starts screaming with its corrections. I caught myself thinking about something very simple. If I wanted to force someone else's network to reveal its internal algorithms, that's exactly what I'd do. I wouldn't hack it. I'd create a slight instability and watch it fix itself. Because in the process of fixing it, you reveal how you work. It all began to look like a conversation, not with words, but with procedures. And that same day, a second strike occurred. We received a message from a small team working on the empty background. They weren't working directly on Guest 2. They were tasked with a completely different level, finding any weak hyperbolic candidates in neighboring sectors. They found another point, weaker than Guest 2, dirtier, and yet with the same rhyming character of movement if you run it through our corridor model. As if the protocol isn't limited to a couple of objects. As if it's a flow. We called it Guest 3, even though the word guest had become hard to bear. Because a guest is someone who comes to your home. But here, it felt like home wasn't us, but the very structure of space, where someone was plotting routes through the nodes. Tom swore and said something that wasn't usually said out loud in a lab. It's a cue. I realized there's a very disturbing dimension to this story. If Guest 2 surfaced after Atlas, and Guest 3 follows suit, then Atlas could indeed have been a calibration. Not a calibration of an object, but a calibration of us. A test of how we react to the beautiful and obvious. Then a test of how we react to the weak and structural. Then a test of how we react to the subtle and ambiguous. And then the levels can continue. From the outside, it will never look like an invasion. From the outside, it will look like a proliferation of oddities in scientific archives. Like a collection of inconsistencies. Like, there have been a lot of interstellar objects lately. But inside, it felt different. It was as if someone had finally decided to systematically go through our system and take a profile. Build a profile. And if the profile was interesting enough, the protocol would continue. Lynn suggested the only sensible step. Stop amplifying the network. Not turn a blind eye, but stop improving in front of whoever might be taking measurements. Switch to a minimal noise mode. And here we've hit a wall we can't get around. The minimum noise for civilization is degradation. It's the abandonment of part of the infrastructure. It's a decline in communication quality. It's a setback. So, if the protocol really exists, it traps us. To protect ourselves, we must become weaker. To become stronger, we become more visible. This isn't science fiction. It's pure observational logic. That night, I returned to the ATLAS archive again, to those moments when it changed color to gold, and it looked like a beautiful effect. I rewatched that episode now as an engineer, as a change in radiation mode, as a channel switch, as a demonstration that an object can change its spectral properties in a way that our best instruments can detect. And a simple, angry feeling struck me. Atlas didn't surprise us. It marked itself. It gave us a marker to remember. And then when we started looking for that marker in the data, we ourselves opened the door to the next one. At dawn, a dry report arrived from the time team. Micro drifts confirmed, cause undetermined. Correlation with the observation windows statistically significant. They tried to write it as usual, neutrally. But between the lines, the panic of professionals was palpable. Time shouldn't fluctuate according to the object's hyperbolic schedule. Tom looked at the paper and said, "It's not about the comet anymore, it's about us now." I didn't answer, because the answer was obvious and unpleasant. If a second guest is tailing us, if a third is already looming, if correlations exist with both our windows and our time, then we're already part of the process. We're already part of the experiment. And then there are two options. Either this truly is some exotic natural phenomenon, manifesting itself so vividly for the first time in the technosphere era. Or it's a civilization testing protocol, and we've just moved into the noticed category. Both options are bad, because in the first case, the laws of nature are broader than we thought, and they can touch our most fundamental foundations. In the second case, someone knows how to use these laws as a tool. By evening, we had made an unspoken decision. No attempts to respond, no messages, no test sequences, only observation and evidence gathering. But even when we decided on this, I understood. The decision itself is already a reaction. And if this is truly a measurement, then the reaction is the goal. If you want, I'll continue from here in the next part. How we tried to silence the technosphere, and why it was precisely at that moment of silence that the strangest signal in history since Atlas appeared.